Now. Hello, everyone. I'm here with Nick Horowitz, a Twitter friend of mine, and he's actually attending a conference, a Low Carb USA conference at the moment. So, hi, Nick.
Hello, Raphael. How are you?
I'm good. I'm in northern Portugal, and you are in the US, right? You're in.
Yeah, I'm right now in the Boston area. The Low Carb USA book conference, which is going awesome, is unfortunately virtual. So hopefully they'll be in person for San Diego this summer. But it's been a lot of fun, a lot of really cool people, cool talk. So I'm excited. I've been up since 2 a.m. doing paper chases. I just couldn't sleep. There were so many questions. Ben Bickman dropped a paper yesterday that I didn't get to read last night, and I had to read it. So anyway.
Yeah, Ben is great. Ben is one of my favorite. He's one of the clearest thinkers in the low carb scene. Every podcast he gives, every presentation he gives, he has this ability to clarify things. I mean, there are a lot of insightful people in that community, but he's particularly clear in his presentations, and I love it.
Story together so well, and like the figures are so simple but not simplistic. And yeah, you're right. He just talks through it really well. Everything's really insightful and just like can get to every level of the audience. So
yeah, that's true. And so just before we started recording, you actually mentioned, you reminded me of how we actually met on Twitter. So I'll just let you take it away and tell people about it, because it's actually quite cool.
No, me and Rafi were just laughing because it's, on Twitter, when somebody replies to a message that's kind of, critical, you put up a tweet and somebody criticizes it, it never ends well if you reply. And so I, try not to reply, but sometimes I get impulsive like everybody and I reply. And that happened with Rafi, except that he thought that I was arguing for calories in, calories out, CECO. And then I thought he was. And we went down the rabbit hole a little bit, like a tiny bit combative. And then we got to the end, we're like, wait. I'm like, do you think I'm arguing for CECO? And he's like, yeah, I thought you were arguing for CECO. I'm like, no, it's complete bogus. Well, not complete bogus. We can talk about that, but more or less. And so that's actually how we met. Yeah. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, it is, and clearly, I'm very trigger happy when it comes to to Chico talk. So I'll have to admit that. But yeah, maybe let's just dig into a few of these details that it's hard to give that nuance on Twitter. So yeah, just take it away.
Oh, I guess with CECO, where I like to start now with talking to people, I stole this from Gary Taubes, but the perception that CECO holds for humans comes from the idea that like thermodynamics should apply to humans, and it does. I mean, like the laws of physics, they apply to everything. And so you take like energy is conserved, and then you turn it into calories in equals, delta calories, change in energy equals calories in, calories out. So let's just say delta energy equals energy in minus energy out. And that is a statement that has to hold. I think we can agree on that. Where we don't agree with the general CECO community, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on your perception, but that, and this is the way Gary puts it, we have the arrow of causality wrong.
Exactly.
People think that you can take calories in and calories out and just control those variables and then easily manipulate delta E. And you can to some extent for a short period of time, but really it's more the other direction, that what you eat, the quality of the food you eat, this lifestyle you live influences how your body wants delta E to be set. And then that influences your hunger drive, how you absorb calories, how you store calories, and how you disperse calories and use calories. So in the end, I think that the delta E is where we have to start with people, not looking at the E in and E out, the calories in, calories out, and we can go down each of those components and why they're really hard to control or impossible over the long term. But if calories in, calories out worked, we would not have an obesity epidemic.
Right. And I think there's an example that I'm fond of, and to be honest, I don't have the paper on hand or the papers on hand, because I think there's something I hear often, which is if you're in a negative energy balance, not saying how much, but just you're in a negative energy balance, you are losing fat. And I think that's wrong. I think if you're in a negative energy balance, you'll be losing weight, because again, energy is conserved, blah, 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 like we said, laws of thermodynamics. But actually fat loss isn't guaranteed from a negative energy balance, because there are so many ways, let's say dials, that you can tweak where those calories can be shunted towards different tissues, essentially, right? So if you give the resistance training stimulus, you're gonna, and you get a sufficient amount of protein and a sufficient amount of calories, you can shift those calories more towards muscle, less towards fat gain. So it's not even good enough to say a negative energy balance will lead to fat loss. I mean, yeah, if you restrict enough, there's going to be some fat that is lost, but it's actually not technically true that a negative energy balance is sufficient for fat loss, from my opinion. And I see that everywhere in the low carb community, not just the typical, if it fits your macros or stuff, just even in the low carb community. This is
right. And I'm going to give a kind of one more down to earth example, or actually it's up on top of earth, and I'll explain that in a minute. And one more technical example, because I think you're spot on with that. A negative energy balance does not contribute to purely fat loss, and a positive energy balance does not contribute purely to fat gain. Yep. And so the example that jumped to mind, that's the up to earth example, is I don't know the woman's name, but the woman who just set the climbing record for Everest, I think the fastest time up and down Everest. Previously, everybody that has done that, it's an enormous expenditure. They go up and they come down and they're completely depleted. They're just wrecked, and they've have to take recovery time because they've lost so much muscle. Gluconeogenesis produce glucose to fuel the body and brain, because they need to spend some degree of glucose. They're carb burners. Then this woman does it. She does it low carb. She's fat adapted. Loses, I don't quote me on these numbers, but I think it was 14 pounds total, and 13 pounds were fat, because she was fat adapted. She could run a fat, and the next day she's in the gym. So you can see the discrepancy when you just shift your metabolism. And then so that's the up to earth example. The one more technical that is somewhat specific, but has to do with something that really interests me, and that's visceral fat. Mm-hmm. So people listening may or may not know that not all fat is created equal. You have subcutaneous fat that's right under your skin, the kind of fat that jiggles, like your love handles or whatever. And that is actually not that unhealthy a type of fat. It releases some positive hormones. It creates insulation. And then there's the visceral fat, which is the one inside your abdominal cavity, kind of around your liver. That is really unhealthy and really pro-inflammatory, and also really hard to get rid of. Things that contribute to it are things like elevated cortisol. So that's why you see, like if you've heard of Cushing's disease, it's a high cortisol disease where people get really skinny arms and legs and this big protruding belly, because they're storing a lot of visceral fat. Drinking contributes to visceral fat gain. And visceral fat is really hard to budge. So I was listening to, I think it was Brian and Tro were talking about this. Specifically, I think it was Brian. And he was saying that he sees, his patients go on low carb, and it's really easy to shift the subcutaneous fat, but not the visceral fat. And there's some weird reasons for why that is. It was talking about this, I think, TRPBR2 protein. But one thing you can do to budge visceral fat is exercise. So he was saying, actually, when you exercise, your cytokines IL-6 and IL-10 go up, and that's a signal to the visceral fat to actually start to burn. And that sets up a positive feedback loop where the visceral fat's not inhibiting muscle gain, and then the muscle and the exercise allows you to drop the visceral fat. So it's a tiny, tiny, a tip of the iceberg example of, how hormones do influence how you partition fat, muscle, fat, and then that just feeds forward, because obviously if you have more muscle tissue, you're burning more energy, and if you have more fat tissue, you have more inflammation, etc. Again, tiny example.
And you have the skinny fat phenomenon, where people on the exterior seem, let's say, normal. And in fact, they have a body composition issue where their subcutaneous fat is maybe normal, but their muscle mass is too low and their visceral fat is too high. So we have people who are over fat, but they don't look fat, and they're actually under muscled. So I think the example you just gave and this one are actually useful to help people understand that it's really a fuel partitioning issue or a fat mass accumulation problem. hormonal, metabolic, immunometabolic problem, however you want to call it. But it's not fundamentally an energy balance issue. I don't think that's even right. I don't think it's, even as a tautology, I don't think it's fundamentally correct.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I think that the colloquial term for that is TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And and because of it, we're missing half the obesity epidemic. I don't know if it's actually half, but a lot of the obesity epidemic. My mom is just an example. She got a Dexa scan because now that I'm into the space, she's into the space, and she's like, Nick, I'm obese. And she's like a petite, small woman. She's like a BMI of, I don't know, 22, 23. She just has no muscle. And so now she's, gaining muscle. She's like up to from 1 knee push-up to like 3 real push-ups. So it's progress. But people need to be aware of this. You can't just look at someone and say, you're skinny, you're healthy, or your BMI is greater than 25, you're unhealthy. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you get a Dexa scan? I'm jealous. I can't get them here.
You just got to find a cooperative doctor. I've gotten a lot of things. Well, I probably shouldn't say the things. I'll give you one more example. I like, CGMs. I love data. CGMs are hard to get. You can't get them if you're not diabetic. So you just find the right person, and then if you're keto, you fast for a day. I just fasted until my glucose was like 58 milligrams per deciliter. And then we documented that one, and she wrote something vague about hypoglycemia, and we got a Dexcom covered by insurance.
Oh, that's smart. That's smart. I I have a type 1 diabetic roommate, and she just asked for an extra patch, basically, with a Freestyle Libre, so I could play around with it for a while. So yeah, there's always a way, usually to get access to that. It's just crazy that we have to game the system to learn how to do preventative medicine for ourselves. It's so crazy.
I think they should be provided to everyone, like vaccines, CGMs. Given that 88% of the population is, metabolically unhealthy, 1 in 3 people have metabolic syndrome. By 2050, 1 in 3 will have diabetes. How are we not providing this? Like, the biofeedback power of a CGM is unbelievable. When you hear, and again, I think this was Brian talking about, like when you have a diabetic patient that you're using CGMs on, and the guy, you can't cheat, and you actually get insight. And so the guy has like 1 caramel, and his blood glucose jumps to 300 milligrams per deciliter, like from 1 caramel. When you don't see that on the app or whatever, you can just kind of like brush it off. When you see it, you can't ignore it. And then people just spontaneously, improve behavior because they actually have insight into what's going on in their bodies. So I think we need to put more data in patients' hands.
It's a game changer, total game changer. Yeah,
I'm just excited for, like, right now we only have continuous glucose monitoring, but what happens when we have, like at home? Actually, Ben was talking about this. Isn't at home, but he's saying he was talking with some people at Stanford, and they're trying to get this like little box-sized machine that you would go in and into the doctor's office, and when the doctor is taking your blood pressure and doing basic vitals, you just get a little drop of blood, and they do a whole metabolic panel every time. Comprehensive stuff, not just basic stuff. And getting those data and tracking them over time, you have to bio-track to biohack. Heard somewhere. And you just, the data is so valuable, especially when patients can understand it, and physicians can communicate to them, or any sort of clinician, healthcare worker can communicate to them, because this change has to start with people.
Yeah, definitely. And there's the metabolic startup project, which Gabor Dosi is consulting for. And I think there are some other people trying to get at-home insulin testing available. I think that's going to be another step function improvement in preventative medicine. Once you get the glucose and the insulin, I mean, we're just going to do away with a large chunk of at least we'll have the potential to do away with a large chunk of the metabolic issues that are plaguing us. So I think there's these low-hanging fruits in the nutrition space. Yeah. And it's so frustrating to not be able to get money and people behind it. Like just as an example, to get back to the CGMs, there was a tweet that I saw from Dr. Tro today or yesterday, where he was basically angry about the commentary given to this low carb meta-analysis about supposedly weight loss being the only determinant of improved glycemia, even on low carb diets, which, sorry, that's not true. Yet, this is coming from a very well respected researcher at King's College London, Nicola Guess. And it's really hard for me to understand that position that she takes, because you can literally buy one, see it on yourself, give it to your family member, give it some patients. It's undeniable. And when I see people denying what's undeniable, then I turn into a cynic, then I start to question intentions. And before that, I try not to the best of my ability.
I think it's broken systems, both in the NHS and the US, where a lot of docs, don't have the bandwidth or the will or, the desire to stay up to date in the literature. And then they just, go with their basic training and then just reinforce the message. And it becomes just an echo chamber, and it's absurd. I have that same frustration. My friend came to me the other day. She's a nurse, and she was like, one of my colleagues, like, I know you're into this nutrition thing, Nick, so I had a question for you. Can you change HDL? Like, is there anything you can do to change it? I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, I just bought my HDL. Like, I can manipulate my carbohydrate intake, and that'll bump my HDL. She's like, oh, because one of my friends in our rounds asked the professor, can you change HDL anyway? And he laughed at her in front of everybody and said, no, there's no way to change HDL.
Oh my God.
And I was just like, he's training this whole cohort of nurses, and he basically just shamed this woman for asking, one, which is a good question, and then two, he gave a complete bullshit answer. Right. And it goes round and round. And then sometimes people are just not interested. Speaking of Tro, he was he was showing us his case series on, various case series, but on dropping triglycerides massively with low carb or manipulating LDL. I don't, he's not someone, and I'm not someone who thinks LDL is necessarily a bad thing, but he had a patient who had an LDL of 575, and for insurance reasons, insurance won't cover you, they wanted to drop it. So he titrated in a little bit of carbs and dropped it to 189. Now, you're supposed to be on a statin. This is what the, I think it's AHA says, if you're above 190. So 189 is that key number. And he documented, look, we dropped cholesterol 400 milligrams per deciliter with lifestyle change versus a statin, which on average is 30 to 80 milligrams per deciliter. Granted, they might not have a high start point, but just lifestyle change, 400 milligrams per deciliter. And they were just disinterested.
That's crazy.
I've been in talks with cardiologists in this area, and it's actually astonishing what they don't know. I can't name this person because I actually don't know the name of this person. Because another doctor told me about this from a confidential conversation, because she was treating a Harvard doc, and nothing against Harvard. I'm going to Harvard, obviously, but there's some problems with the system. And they're a doc, and they say that they're eating low carb. She asks them what he's having for breakfast, and it included orange juice and a bagel. And he said he was low carb, and she's like, "So you're not eating carbs?" He's like, "No." He didn't understand that carbs weren't just like sugar. That was his perception.
Wow.
And this is somebody who is working at right now top medical school in the country, which
that's scary.
Many amazing people there, but just the docs, it's not their fault. They don't learn nutrition. It's not taught. And that is just unbelievably, it is absurd. And the people don't learn about the biochemistry and the metabolism. And then you get claims like LDL is bad. Right.
Yeah. I don't think you know this, but I was tested for familial hypercholesterolemia many years ago now. I think it was 2013, maybe 2012, 2013, because my LDL cholesterol went so high when I went low carb. So I'd have to
ballpark it for me. I want to compete with you. Not that we should be doing that, but now I'm curious. Mine also has gone sky high.
I can tell you, I have it here. I have all my medical records, and while I look for it, I'll tell you. So basically, it went sky high. to the level where the guy wanted to test me, and I said, sure, more data, I'm pretty happy. So we tested it, and I was negative, and he wanted to put me on a atorvastatin medium dose, which you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is it 40 milligrams, 30 milligrams?
Don't know the dosing exactly. Yeah, atorvastatin. It's funny. I was just talking with someone about that this morning. Atorvastatin is also known as Lipitor. But let's delve into this, because this is one of my favorite topics to discuss, because it's so nuanced. So I'll say a similar thing happened to me. I went low carb and my cholesterol went through the roof. I think my LDL started at 90 baseline, and it's gotten as high as 550 milligrams per deciliter.
550. Okay, I have it here. My LDL cholesterol in this test was from last March, so it's relatively recent, and I was at 10 millimole, which is 390 grams per liter, so just under 400. So you beat me, damn.
No, I mean, again, this is one of the most things. I think people in the low carb space get kind of zealous and think, LDL is the best thing ever. Why would you ever want to lower it? And I don't necessarily agree with that, because we can't say, I think that don't think there is sufficient evidence to suggest that LDL alone can drive atherosclerosis. But I also know that we do not have long-term data on people with LDLs like 550. We just don't. And so I'm not going to make any claims that my LDL is ideal, but it's all the data we have is on populations that are metabolically unhealthy eating a mixed diet, and there is no data whatsoever showing that LDL contributes. That LDL is to drive itself into the artery wall and contribute to atherosclerosis or heart disease independent of inflammation and oxidative stress. There isn't data, and there's also zero data. There's a lot of statin data. The results are blown out of proportion. Atorvastatin Lipitor, for example, it's reported as a 36% reduction in heart disease risk. It's actually 1.1%. They just turned the the absolute risk into a relative risk. David Diamond gives great talks on this. But there's a lot of data on statins, and at the population level, they do decrease heart disease. But there is not one paper that shows a statin can improve outcomes in someone with high HDL and low LDL who's a non-smoker.
So right, the Dave Feldman challenge.
Yeah. Right, he has that. It's like if you can find that study, he'll give you he's bumped it up to $300 or something. And so that's telling. And although there aren't data on people with really, really high LDLs, there are anecdotes, and that's worth something. So this woman, I hope she doesn't mind me promoting her name, because I thought it was interesting. But she's in the LMAS hyperresponders group on Feldman's Facebook page, and she has an LDL even higher than mine. Hers hovers around 700. And 2 years ago, she got a CIMT, which is a carotid intima media thickness. So that's a functional test, actually looking at atherosclerosis. You can get CACs or CIMTs. And 2 years is also the time frame that they often use for statin or Zetia trials or whatever, if they're doing CIMTs, or at least I've seen some studies that do that. So it's a long enough time frame to be reasonable. And if LDL alone was sufficient to drive atherosclerosis, you would expect hers would go up, probably substantially. It went down.
Right.
Again, that's an N equals 1. I can't draw that much from it, but it's just at least we should be skeptical. More people should be skeptical. More MDs should be skeptical of the basic LDL hypothesis, that high LDL, high ApoB, to be more correct, high LDL particle count, can alone drive atherosclerosis. I do not believe that is the case. That said, now I'm going to play devil's advocate against myself, just because I like to do that. And
it's fun.
So butt in if you have any thoughts. But I was talking with Dr. Richard Isaacson over at Cornell. He's the head of the Alzheimer's preventive medicine group, and it seems like a lovely guy. I only spoke to him briefly, but he told me that his cholesterol guru is this guy, Dr. Lipid on Twitter,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, do you know him?
Hmm.
His
Yeah, he blocked me.
his Tom Dayspring, Dr. Tom Dayspring.
Yeah.
Sorry, I use his proper name. Dr. Lipid's a cool handle, so I call that
It
out.
is.
But
It is.
he honestly, I listened to Peter Attia's The Drive has a 7-hour podcast on it, broken into 5 parts. And there's an update that I still have to listen to. But he said, listen to this, like to get my, he wanted to get my thoughts, and I wanted to hear it. Honestly, he knows his stuff. Like, it was good.
Sure.
Good podcast. I still have to go back and listen to this to one episode because there's a lot of stuff I had to learn from him. And so I think we could have a great discussion. I haven't talked with him yet, but he believes that ApoB can drive, like if you have a high ApoB, high LDL particle count, you have to bring it down. That it's a driver of atherosclerosis. He says that multiple times. And one thing he never says in the podcast is, or never demonstrates at all, it suggests that any data that LDL, high particle count, and high ApoB alone can drive heart disease. This is what I'm saying. That there's this disconnect, this leap of logic where he's saying just having high LDLs can drive them in to cause atherosclerosis. But for the vast majority of the population, he's right. Really high LDLs, because there's co-occurring metabolic pathologies, can be harmful. If you have a high LDL particle count and you have a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation, it's not a good thing. And because so few people, even people that are low carb, have really good oxidative stress and inflammation markers, it becomes complicated. It becomes complicated whether or not you maybe should consider whether or not a LDL of 700 like Amelia's, or 550 like mine, or around 400 like yours is optimal. For me, I'll just say I'm not medicating right now. But if the question arises, I think it's one that we actually, as a community, have to not be so dogmatic about and have to entertain for lots of reasons: patient, person priorities, actual health reasons, but also, like Tro was saying, like insurance. I'm not going to be able to get insurance with the cholesterol where it is. So I could just carb up for a couple of days and then bump it down and do the Feldman protocol. But what I wanted to get to then is what are the options for lipid lowering medications? I don't know if you looked into this at all. I was
a little.
Yeah, just so I'll go through. Please stop. I feel like I'm just talking, and
go ahead. I want your thoughts on this, and then I'll cut you off at some point.
So let's talk about statins first, because I am more or less anti-statin. There's the most literature on them, but it's more or less their holdover from the epidemiology and the early controlled trials when we didn't really understand what cholesterol was or even how to measure it. And just as a complete sidebar, people should know that you don't get your LDL measured directly. It's estimated. So what they actually do is they take total cholesterol, they lyse up the cholesterol containing particles, and they take total cholesterol, they subtract the HDL fraction, and then they subtract triglycerides divided by 5, which is supposed to be a proxy for VLDL. There might be some errors in there, and it goes off when you have hypertriglyceridemia, but we're not even directly measuring LDL, let alone doing subfractionation. So there's a lot of reasons basic cholesterol panels are, I think, problematic. In fact, I wrote a paper on this. Maybe we can link it in the show notes, but it was titled something like, standard lipid panel is insufficient for care of a person on a ketogenic diet. Basically, like, the rules of metabolism change a little bit when you're eating low carb. So take that as you will. But statins, issues with them are, especially related to low carb. The way they work is they inhibit the enzyme HMG-CoA reductase. Now, HMG-CoA reductase is not only important for the generation of cholesterol, but downstream of it is also the generation of, guess what, ketone bodies. So you're inhibiting the rate-limiting enzyme for cholesterol and ketone body synthesis. So, and someone say who's a lean mass hyperresponder, are you, bottlenecking the energy availability? Dave Energy's, energy model. I think it's a plausible explanation. Not only that, but statins are lowering vitamin K2 synthesis. Vitamin K2 is important for preventing vascular disease. They're impairing mitochondrial function, inhibiting coenzyme Q synthesis, and diminishing complex 4 mitochondrial function. The interesting thing about complex 4 is it's characteristically impaired in Alzheimer's disease. There's a link between statins and cognitive impairment, and statins can cross the blood-brain barrier, especially the lipophilic statins like Lipitor, which you mentioned earlier. So, there are a lot of downsides to consider. More than just that, but that alone, it brings up a question mark. It doesn't say you should never use statins for no one, but nobody tends to, very, very few, if any, patients are communicated this information. But this is still the first line treatment, and it is still the recommendation that if you have an LDL over 190, you should go on a statin, period. End of story. And that's just, I think, medical malpractice.
Right. It's the guidelines.
Yeah, but especially for people like, say, at high risk for cognitive decline. Like I'm ApoE4 homozygous. My dad is ApoE4, therefore he hasn't done genetic testing, but he must have given one to me. And so it's just like, he's on Lipitor, but why the hell is he on Lipitor when there are other options? Now, what are the other options? So, aside from low carb, and we should be clear that low carb doesn't increase LDL in everyone. In fact, it's a minority of people. If anything, it often decreases LDL associated with weight loss. But there are other medication options, and the two I wanted to highlight are Zetia and the PCSK9 inhibitors. So Zetia, the way Zetia works is it blocks cholesterol uptake in the gut, and it blocks cholesterol reuptake from the biliary system. And what this does is it forces your liver to kind of, deplete itself of cholesterol a little bit. And so it's reducing cholesterol, which is cool. But a cool thing I think about it, with respect to low carb, again, relating this mostly to low carb, is that whereas statins decrease HMG-CoA reductase, that is their main mechanism of action. That is how they work, and I think it's not something you necessarily want to do. Again, it inhibits ketogenesis. As a compensatory mechanism to not being able to uptake cholesterol in the gut and biliary system, Zetia actually increases HMG-CoA reductase.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Which is really interesting. And I actually learned this from Dayspring, Dr. Tom Dayspring, the guy that said to me, maybe I don't see eye to eye on, but this is one thing I learned from him. I read a paper that he wrote going over the mechanisms of Zetia, and it was included in there. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So we should have educated and open dialogues with the people that don't see eye to eye. But that was an interesting thing about Zetia, and it's obviously not going to affect the brain, so that downside of statins. And then the PCSK9 inhibitors are really the big one that are coming to the fore. And the way they work is they decrease levels of this protein PCSK9. And what PCSK9 does is it targets LDL receptors for degradation. And so basically you're increasing LDL receptors. And so the LDL receptors will pull the LDL out of the bloodstream. That's the main mechanism of action. They actually lower LDL more on average than statins. So statins on average, I think, is 30 to 80, and PCSK9 is 550 to 150 milligram per deciliter drops.
That's a good improvement.
They appear to be more effective, but also, again, they're not inhibiting HMG-CoA reductase. And they're not necessarily, if you're worried about energy flux in Dave Feldman's model, they're not necessarily actually limiting that. They're decreasing LDL, but they might just be increasing turnover and increasing flux. So you have a smaller LDL pool in the blood, but your flux might be fine. And so if you want to optimize and if you do want to bring a LDL particle count down and LDL down, a PCSK9 inhibitor might not be a terrible option. Other thing it does is PCSK9 inhibitors, Lp(a).
Yeah.
Lp(a) is an ApoB containing lipoprotein particle. It tends to be genetically determined, or people think it's genetically determined. PCSK9 can actually decrease it by 8 to 55%, which is interesting if you have a high Lp(a) genetically and a high inflammation. So Saboya Huggins has a great talk on Lp(a), one to link to as well. I forget where she gave it, but it's very insightful on Lp(a). So if people want to look that up, I recommend it. It's again by Seboya, who is I think that's how you pronounce her name, who's a colleague of Dave Feldman's. But anyway,
Yeah,
so those
Shaban's
are
great.
just some
She's a friend.
fun. Yeah, no. I really love that lecture. So I learned so much from the people around this space. But it's just, you have a low carbon lifestyle, and I think that's where everybody should start. That's where I'm starting. But you never know. And these are discussions that I think we should have openly. And I'm not big on the statins for the reasons I just explained. But the Zetia and the PCSK9, I think they're safer, if anything. And
So I definitely agree that Zetia is safer, and I think Peter Attia uses it in his practice quite a bit, probably for some of the reasons that you gave, and for some of the reasons that Dayspring gave as well. However, PCSK9s, there are some pretty, I can't name them off the top of my head, but I remember some pretty significant trials which showed either a basically no improvement in all-cause mortality, or even a decrease in all-cause mortality, increase in all-cause mortality. Sorry.
It'd be interesting to know what population that's in, because I mean that again, this comes to, is LDL bad? Because if you're looking at a broad population, that's what we find with decreasing LDL in general. Right. It just, you decrease LDL, all-cause mortality can go up, especially in the elderly population. So again, I'm not arguing LDL is bad by any means. It should be tailored to the individual, but I'm not entirely surprised to know that's the case, or to hear that's the case. But I think it's interesting. I don't think we should completely dismiss Western medicine, because people tend to go to this argument, and I don't like this, that we should just live evolutionarily, end of story. And the reason I don't like that is because, one, we're never going to achieve that. You're not walking around naked on the African plain. You're just not. You should take a vitamin D supplement, because I'm clothed and I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, high latitude, where I'm not getting good sunlight, even if I were outside. So I should be on vitamin D, and I am. But also considerations like, I talked about this ApoE4 gene. So ApoE4 is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of people I hear in the low carb community argue it's the evolutionary allele, therefore eat saturated fat and do whatever, and you should be fine. And maybe they're right. But consider that it's an inflammatory gene that's good at protecting from acute infection during reproductive years. So evolution is going to select for it. It doesn't give a shit, well, more or less, what happens once you're post-reproductive. And so this gene that was selected for evolution might not be serving our best interest. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not, because I don't want to get Alzheimer's disease in the current context. And so when people, are aware of their genetics, or just individuals in general, you have to consider what are people's priorities, and how to treat them as an individual. And that's why I think we shouldn't dismiss the conversation altogether, although I am definitely not a statin advocate, nor do I think LDL is harmful per se.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. The logical leap people make, I think, is evolution equals natural equals good. I think this is how they get there, basically, right? Evolution has to do with our past and when we were in nature, so it's natural, so it's good. And it's so frustrating, because the idea that evolution by natural selection is there is no modern medicine without it, in my mind. I mean, you can have emergency medicine without it, but even there, it's going to be useful. But you really can't have true medicine without evolution, just like you can't have physics without Newtonian mechanics or quantum physics. And so you and me, we want to push for people to think in evolutionary terms, but it's so hard to get people to do that and not come up with these. Just they don't get it. They don't get what it means. They don't get that there are trade-offs. Like you said, there's the benefit in your reproductive years versus a downside when you're getting maybe closer to being grandmother or grandfather, for example. So
then antagonistic pleiotropy is the nerd term.
Yeah, antagonistic pleiotropy, exactly. That's exactly right. And yeah, so to jump back to the statin question, which, because you brought up very many good points on it. I think one of the things with statins that unfortunately when it gets brought up, it's seen sort of as detracting from the scientific conversation, but I actually don't think it does. And that is the fact that there are such a number of negative trials that have been suppressed. And we've seen this with antidepressants, and we've seen this with cholesterol science. So when people bring to me like the Jupiter trial showing the secondary prevention improvement in all-cause mortality, I'm like, okay, but what's your denominator? And it's like, oh, well, you know, what are you going to do? I'm like, yeah, well, if I don't know the denominator, I don't have the context within which to interpret this potentially very significant result, because when you apply those very small improvements in absolute risk reduction to big populations, you can have a real benefit, even if the absolute risk reduction is small. So really, I would like statins to work. This is the thing that I'm sure a lot of people would be surprised who know me, who know that I'm quite anti-statin. I'll give you a personal example. When my father had a subdural hematoma last year, I was desperate trying to look for therapies, looking at, you know, survival outcomes with cortisone and you know, all the steroids that they wanted to give him, if it was better, if it was not. And I came on a paper where they were looking at statins as a potential short-term treatment for subdural hematomas, a bilateral one in my father's case. And I was praying to see benefit. I've never been so pro-statin in my life, you know, at that point, just hoping that this drug that I've been criticizing for so many years now is going to show a benefit in a condition that's very relevant to my dad. So, you know, I think I just bring this up because to get people to understand that the critiques, they're not coming from an ideological position, although they may very well seem like it. But I think that, like you said, we don't want to shit on modern medicine. We don't want to shit on Western medicine. Emergency medicine is a jewel. It's an accomplishment. But Western medicine, leaving aside emergency medicine, emergency medical care, it's pretty terrible. Like it's not very good. It's sad, it's crazy, but it is the case. And I think that statins and the LDL hypothesis of heart disease, or the ApoB gradient hypothesis of heart disease, I think these things have been tested to death. They've been tested, and billions and billions of dollars have gone into them. And we're in the end, you know, this is also a self-criticism of our community and the larger nutritional community at large. We focus so much energy on these drugs, and it's interesting. You know, we're still talking about it, right? It's interesting. So I'll recognize that. But I think that the opportunity cost to keep exploring these sort of gray area results and negative results and hiding the side effects and hiding the negative trials. And, you know, there's one point where I'm like, I'm just not, you know, there are these dozens of other things I could be exploring to understand how I can manage my health. And instead, the sort of institutional impetus has taken us in this direction where we sort of, it's like we're going to keep arguing about it in the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's what I feel like. And you and I, we can nerd out on the trials and the biochemistry, and it's fun. It's fun. You know, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I just think as a whole, as a community, as a medical community, I think we would do well to sort of be like, you know, take it if you want, don't take it if you want, but let's explore the new stuff, right? Let's explore all the other drugs and the other lifestyle interventions and stuff that could be just fantastic. I mean, there's a wonderful series of blog posts by Malcolm Kendrick who sums up statins pretty well. The best thing you can say for them, if you're being at the most generous you can, is that they will extend your lifespan by a matter of days, up to, I think it's a couple of, actually it'll take a few days away from your life, the bottom end of the range, or it will add like, you know, a couple more days or maybe a week or two. I think that was the max that they were able to show. And that for me is such a small benefit. Like if that's the best data the statin proponents can show, literally a handful of days when you do the stats right and you don't fall into this relative risk trap and all of that, it's kind of flabbergasting to me. I'm like, okay, I'll believe you. It'll add the days of life, but for what? Like for a few days?
Yeah, I think you'd hit the nail on the head with a lot of things there. One of them being opportunity cost and the magnitude of effect. Literally, like 2 seconds before I got on the Zoom with you, David Unwin was finishing his lecture on, it was a murder mystery case. He put it forward as what causes hypertension, and he was talking about SGLT2 inhibitors and showing some of his data, his published data, and he was showing that, look, SGLT2 inhibitors work to lower blood pressure. They basically block the protein that reuptakes glucose and sodium in the kidneys. So you pee out salt and you pee out glucose, and then patients will lose weight and their blood pressure will go down. Guess what? Low carb, much better for both weight loss, definitely for glycemia control, and much better for blood pressure control as well. So you have a drug that, yeah, it has an effect. Absolutely has an effect. Low carb is better. So why is that not included in the standard of care in the NHS? Exactly. Why, when I go to the NHS and I'm hospitalized, they need to give me a glucose infusion because my glucose is at 60 and they think I'm going to die? That happened. So like, you have to sign a waiver because you're refusing medical treatment. I'm like, what is this? Like, just check my ketones or something. Like, don't give me sugar. Anyway, that's
so tell me about your NHS experience, because even before we started recording, you mentioned you worked there. So the NHS is the UK's national health system for those who don't know. So what were you doing there? How long did you stay? What was your experience like?
Well, I was doing my PhD at Oxford. I finished my undergraduate at Dartmouth only in 2018, so I'm kind of recent. Then I went straight to Oxford to do my PhD and just finished that up. I was looking at neurometabolism and neurodegenerative disease, specifically Parkinson's, and the role that ketones might play. So I was running a clinical trial within the NHS. It was just a bit of a bear. That was kind of on me. I was a foreign student running a clinical trial with an academic institution that was funded by an industry sponsor with a private benefactor. It was very complicated, and there wasn't a legal team to help me, so it just became complicated. But yeah, I just got to see a little bit the degree to which, and I even saw this more as a patient, because it was really during my early days at Oxford that my own metabolic conditions came to the force, which really were, the worst of them was like severe ulcerative colitis. So when I first moved to Oxford, within a couple of weeks, I had a flare that made me lose 20% of my body weight. In like a couple of weeks, my heart rate went into the 20s. What? And I was in the NHS. I was in a palliative care ward.
Oh my God.
Because they had nowhere else to put me. And so it was during I remember that experience very acutely. I was hospitalized one other time, but it wasn't as severe. And this is just before I started keto. And that actually reversed that problem. But yeah, I was in the palliative care ward for 3 days. And I remember they put, a catheter in my arm that they never used. I was up for 3 days straight because they couldn't set the heart rate, the monitor to not beep when my heart rate went below 30. And so it kept beeping. Plus, it was a ward filled with people with dementia who were literally dying. It was the first time I ever heard death. 2 people died, and there were people with dementia just running around screaming. And the doctors were, obviously stressed. The nurses were actually very, very nice, but they were stressed. And I didn't get any care. And then after multiple days, they came in and offered the most absurd proposal for bradycardia that you will ever hear. This is after like putting me through the ringer. I mean, I was poked, I was prodded, but I was also like deprived of water for 24 hours because they wanted to do a CAT scan and they couldn't do the scan if I had drank, but then they couldn't schedule the scan. So they just kind of left me. So not only didn't I didn't get food, but didn't get water for 24 hours, and I wasn't sleeping. So it was like, this is patient. I felt patient abused. But after 3 days, I pulled 3 all-nighters in my life, and 2 of them were those 2 nights, or 3, I don't know, whatever. They came in and they had found some esoteric, like, paper from Mexico in Spanish, a case study where this woman had too much turmeric and got acute bradycardia. And
Mhm.
they noted that curcumin you can use for ulcerative colitis. It's anti-inflammatory. It's an active component in turmeric. They're like, oh, it must be the curcumin, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because one, they're like, oh, so your urine should be yellow. I'm like, no,
No,
it's not.
that's not how it
I
works.
can
Have you
change.
never eaten like curry?
But also, I'm like, I just my brain was not being perfused at this time, and even I had
Yeah.
the mind to Google what is the half life of turmeric and curcumin in the body. It's 7 to 13 hours. I've been there without it for 3 days, and my heart rate was still in the 20s. And I said that
Oh
to
my
them,
God.
and they still said it was turmeric. And then I was discharged with a heart rate in the 20s.
What? How is that? Wow. I
That's
don't know
what
what to
I mean.
say.
Yeah, it was. That's what I think about when I think about the NHS. And again, that one attending was. I do not have good feelings towards her. But there are a lot of amazing people in the NHS, people that I worked with as part of the clinical trials. Michelle Hu was the chief investigator on my studies, and obviously Dr. Unwin is there, and he's unbelievable. So I'm not blaming the people, but the system is so shattered,
Yeah.
and we just need how we shift to a value-based care system is really a big question, especially in the United States. I think the NHS, weirdly or not, has more potential
Hmm.
because improving health outcomes will save them money because the government pays for it. That's not the
Hmm.
case in the US. So Dr. Unwin showed that the NHS would save, millions of pounds, something like, or maybe billions. I don't know. It was something crazy, something like 277 billion. Maybe it was million. I think it was billion.
I
If
think
they
that's
implemented it,
conservative. Whatever figure he gave, it's conservative because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that he's basing that mainly on like diabetes and
no, it was
maybe
only on diabetes.
obesity.
I'm talking about
Okay.
just on diabetes, but
Yeah.
that will be the saving cost. But you have to make the economic argument
Yeah.
to get things to change. But in the US, like private insurance, you can't make that argument
Hmm.
because we don't have a government supported system. And so I actually don't know, how we towards a system that actually puts patients first. I don't.
Yeah, it's a
And I
difficult
don't know who's going to
question.
solve it. And it has to
Yeah,
start
it's
with
a
education. And
yeah, and I don't know. There's an interesting idea that Rob Wolf has put forth a few times for the U.S. system specifically, where he recommended people open a health savings account or open an account and use it as a health savings account. And I think that's a way to bridge people from their worst situations to keep on going if they can get into the mindset of saying, I'm going to have some health costs and I need to put money aside, which of course it's very difficult for a lot of people, but I think a lot of people misspend their money as well. So it's not bad advice, but it's not a long-term viable solution. But I can see it as helpful for people who might have some uh, insight into the fact that preventive medicine is important and they're not going to get a lot of help from their doctors. But if they can start setting money aside and taking the right lifestyle changes, they're going to at least have an opportunity to cushion themselves. In France and in the UK, it's harder when everything is nationalized to do that. And you're sort of stuck in there. So I see what you mean by the potential, but actually navigating it in the short term. Um, I'm not sure which is harder or better. I'm undecided, to be honest.
I mean, it's maybe I'm misunderstanding the proposal. You're saying that Rob Wolf put forward, but it sounds almost just like a rainy day fund for when you need a treatment. But
I guess. Yeah.
I I I don't think that's sufficient. One, because if you have to get chemo, you need insurance for that. Like most people will not be able to
Right.
afford cancer treatment. Period. And you
Hmm.
get cancer, like maybe
Yeah.
that low carb can decrease your chances, maybe, but it's not going to like make you immune to cancer.
Yeah.
And so people can get sick. Anybody can get sick, even metabolically healthy people. So we need support, but we also I think we need people to invest every single day, not put away for a rainy day, but actually care about what they put into their bodies. And people aren't going to
Hmm.
do that until they understand why they're doing what they're doing. And that brings us back to like CGMs and buying
Yeah.
quality food and investing in, if somebody really cares, like I find it really silly when someone says to me, Nick, it's unreasonable to expect people to buy, pastured eggs and grass-fed beef because it's more expensive and people don't have the money to do that. And those same people are going to Starbucks and buying $7 coffees.
Exactly.
The differential between like grain-fed farm factory processed meats with like plastic microparticles and antibiotics and nice white oak pastures grass-fed meat is not that of a Starbucks Frappuccino. People go for that. And it's actually a feat of engineering that places like the food industries are able to put so much crap into the drinks. I don't know if you ever looked at the nutrition info I went back and it's like when I used to go to Dairy Queen when I was like an adolescent and get a blizzard, like a large blizzard. I think the one I used to get, it was, and you can look up this information online. It was like 150 grams of sugar, 1,520 calories. Not that I, care about calories, but in the context of 150 grams of sugar after dinner in a drink, that's like astonishing. And somehow they managed to it's like, yeah, we can pull off like a 200-gram carb drink and there are like 2 grams of fiber, which is
wow.
Again, not that I'm saying fiber is necessarily good, but I'm like, wow, that's a feat of engineering. You can get that much carbs in that little fiber. I'm impressed.
That's impressive. Yeah. Wow.
It's stunning what people eat. And and I was talking with someone on Twitter that I said that the average American eats 3,600 kilocalories a day. And like, how do they do that? Have you ever been to a carnival?
Right.
You know what's in these, like that drink was almost half of that 3,600 right there. Go to Subway and get a healthy fish sandwich, a tuna melt. I think it's like 2,000 calories, all the soybean oil mayonnaise they have in it. And that was the kind of thing I would eat when I was, after soccer practice when I was a kid, and I thought this was healthy. I'm getting tuna. Just education, the basic people don't know. People think fat fruit is healthy and whatever. And I don't even know. Let's not stop there. I mean, this is depressing.
No, that's too. That's too depressing.
And I'm like, wow, we really don't want to end that there.
No, definitely not.
Optimism.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of optimistic stuff on the horizon. I know that Dave Feldman is working hard behind the scenes to try to test his. Basically trying to test the idea that having very high cholesterol levels will lead to high coronary CAC scores, basically. And so I think
the high cholesterol will lead to, so challenging that null hypothesis?
Yeah, he's trying to see if people who would fit the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, do they have accelerated calcification of the arteries, basically?
So that's the null hypothesis he's dealing with, and I would expect you to refute it.
Yeah, I know he's really trying to make that happen, and I think that's great. People who take the initiative to turn their ideas into testable hypotheses in the real world, and make predictions that can be verified. I'm very proud of him and proud to be his friend whilst he's doing that. And I wish more people, especially people who are already doctors, would do that more often, because there's a big opportunity just with, look at what Tro is doing with the case reports. That's fantastic. That's literature. It's peer-reviewed literature. Yeah, it's not a controlled study. Who cares? You have to start somewhere, and it's still meaningful. So yeah, I think that's very encouraging.
Yeah, those people are just, they're inspirations. Dave in particular, just living that N=1 lifestyle, and always he's so good about communicating and genuinely acting as a scientist and challenging his own hypotheses. And I try to model myself off that. I think about Dave when I'm just like, people come to me with like, first the carnivore diet, which I thought was absurd. And at the point I thought it was absurd, I'm like, you know what? Because I think it's absurd, I have to try it.
Right.
Because if I don't, I'm not a scientist. And guess what? I did, and it was very interesting. And I learned, I really changed my perspective on it. I'm not saying it's a diet for everyone, but changed my mind. And you just have to continue to do that. And that's the only way science progresses. You don't necessarily have to test it on yourself, but let's, not fall into the same trap that most scientists do and the standard medical establishment does, which is just really just resting with those null hypotheses to the point of harm. And I think that's where our community gets frustrated, low carb community gets frustrated. And again, then the rhetoric gets a little bit combative and maybe not so functional, just because it is frustrating. But I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of good people.
Yeah. I want to jump back to what you mentioned just in passing, that you were in the hospital with a massive flare-up of ulcerative colitis. For those who don't know, that's one of the inflammatory bowel disorders that essentially there's inflammation, destruction to the colon. And it's very common. I think there's 1 in 117 Americans who have an inflammatory bowel disorder. I think that was data from 2015. So it's not, it's relative. It's the rates are increasing, the prevalence are increasing. I just wrote an article for the paleodiet.com website this week on it. And so you mentioned that you managed to handle that. Basically, you managed to get over that, the worst of it, at least. And this is something that I'm struggling with, but I've never been in such a severe case as you have. So I'm curious to hear more about it.
Yeah. Well, every case is obviously different. I was a high risk individual to start. I was a C-section baby who got IV antibiotics like in my first year of life, and then ate a pretty standard crappy diet during my adolescence, even though I thought I was being healthy. So one point I want to make about that is, and this is what we said before, just because you're thin, and I never had trouble with weight, I'm just kind of one of those people that I could eat like shit and I wouldn't get fat. I'm 5'7", and I don't think I could ever work to be 150 pounds. I just don't think I could pull it off. So anyway, that aside, I thought I was healthy. I thought I was the pinnacle of health when I was 18. I was running sub-3 marathons. I thought everything was kicking. And then things just started to fall apart. And a couple things happened, but one of them was pretty bad ulcerative colitis. That was one of my metabolic diseases. So I had terrible inflammation and just lost everything. I went from, being able to, like I run sub-3 hour marathons, actually set a master's push-up record, and then I couldn't even like rolling over in bed was an effort. Like it was that bad. Wow. And I was in the hospital, and I tried basically, I tried every medication I tried did not work that well. The first line treatments like mesalamine didn't keep me in remission. I tried some other agents, and they can cause, for my gut issues, and they were problematic. One had me convulsing on the floor for 24 hours. It was a serotonergic agent. And I tried a bunch of different diets, including, the standard like plant-based, and then to try to recover weight. When I had lost some weight from the colitis, I was advised to just have a lot of anything I could that had calories. So I had nutritionists calling me, say, you should have some pasta now and some ice cream. And I'm saying, no, it hurts. But they're like, oh, be compliant. I'm like, fine, because I don't know anything. And I didn't at the time. And so it was after that stint in the hospital where I was just like, this is it. Like, if I don't actually take responsibility for my health, I'd like to be able to rely on people. And people would, and especially as a kid, I wanted to, and it just became. I think a lot of people. That's how people get introduced to this community. Oftentimes, for better, definitely for worse. Actually, I wish that didn't have to happen. But a lot of people, they have a health catastrophe, or a family member has a health catastrophe, and they're forced into a last-ditch attempt of, like, I'm going on the internet to find anything I can. And it was the last thing I came to. It was like a ketogenic diet, and I'm like, I have no expectations. This isn't going to work, but I also have nothing to lose. So what the hell? Within 1 week, my inflammation, my calprotectin, that's how you measure in the stool, dropped from 5 times the upper limit of high, normal, to the lowest it's ever been. It went from 150 to 20, well within normal range. It's never gone up again. I've come off all my meds. Ulcerative colitis for me is not an issue. I have other IBS issues, and my stomach might never be perfect. But I do not need meds to control my inflammation or colitis, and I'm not worried about a flare. I'm not worried about going back to the hospital like that. That will not happen to me again. I can say that pretty confidently. My ulcerative colitis, they say permanent remission. I would argue it's reversed. I would argue that inflammatory diseases, more or less, are not your immune system breaking, but you have a hypersensitive immune system that your poking with a continuous stimulus. And if you remove that stimulus, it goes away. Just like diabetes, if you're insulin resistant, you remove the sugar, the diabetes, the term is reversed.
Right.
If you don't cure it, you do reverse it. And when I do come out of ketosis and I lax out, I actually get some more inflammatory issues. My knee swells up, I get rosacea. I haven't pushed myself to the point where I would, have another colitis flare, but that's just the way I am.
Okay.
That's my sensitivity. And I think everybody's a little bit different. Every case is a little different. It sounds like you struggle with similar things, and maybe being, low carb and keto alone just has improved things, not completely reverse things. It's not a silver bullet, but it worked a hell of a lot better than any drug I tried. So.
Wow, that's amazing. So 2 questions for you. 1, how do you handle fibrous foods? And 2, when you say you're in ketosis, can you define that with a number? How do you do that?
Well, yeah, I can definitely define that with a number. I can pull up my Keto Mojo. They nicely sent me their new GK Plus. And so I've been tracking it to doing a Sesame Oil Experiment, actually. I know people are against
you mentioned
oils.
that.
I am generally against the oils, but again, N equals 1. So we'll get to that in a minute. But your first question, how do I handle fibrous foods? Not that well. I'm interested in this concept, though, of microbiome resilience. And I'm not, and what I mean by that is I was on like a Mediterranean style ketogenic diet. And then I went carnivore, and some other issues, more IBS constipation, improved. And so I would think that maybe I don't handle fibrous foods that well. But titrating in a little bit more, I've been trying to titrate in a little bit plant material. And the reason being, I'll tell you why. 1, it actually hasn't irritated me that badly. And I'm focusing on insoluble fibers, which are non-fermentable. So they're more likely to speed up gastric transit rather than slow it down. But also, the biodiversity in a system generally offers resilience. And so it stands to reason that if you have more diverse diet, your microbiome will be more diverse, and there'll be a little bit more of a buffer zone. So what I noticed is when I cut fiber out completely, my symptoms on average improved, but they're more variable. It's much more easy to irritate them, including these that I have before. So I'm wondering if it's adaptive to kind of titrate things back into, a happy point for me where it's tolerable, but also I have a little bit more buffer room. So if I do have to say, I don't know what I want to do in the future, but again, we're both young guys. Like maybe I'm dating and I actually want to go out, and I'm not going to be afraid of scallions on my steak or something. Then maybe it's helpful for me as an individual to have a little bit of a flexibility. So I'm playing with that. Short answer is I don't tolerate fiber that well. I focus on insoluble fibers because I have a IBS-C type profile. So constipation is more of an issue than
we're the opposite. I can't even remember once in my life, I think, where I've been, maybe like a handful of times in my whole 31 years of life. But otherwise, for me, the ulcerative colitis is always diarrhea. Which means having way too many trips to the toilet, which is just fucking annoying. It hasn't affected my social life, but it's annoying.
When I had flares, it would be, that's what colitis is, bloody diarrhea. The weird thing is it's like a pendulum where if you have the type of UC I have, if you're not in a flare, you tend to be more, it's actually pretty common to have a constipation profile. Just the way the nerves get rewired. But because I'm not planning on going back into a flare or using that for treatment, it might be something that I have to fiddle with for a while. And it's definitely improved, but I'm still, pulling the levers. Again, we're both pretty early on in our journeys, so there's a lot of finagling to do. But then with respect to my ketone levels in the morning, fasted. So most days I do a 16-8. Sometimes I shift to 14-10 and then do an extra meal because I usually do 2 meals a day. Sometimes I do 3. But it depends on the day. Sometimes I OMAD, whatever. But they generally run most mornings around 2.5 millimoles per liter.
Okay, that's pretty deep. That's pretty deep.
So here's the interesting thing is, and then they can get up to like, if I do OMAD 4.2, but on carnivore, pure carnivore, they would not go above 1.2 in the morning.
Yeah,
And so,
mine are max 1.5 with carnivore, I would say.
So I was for with more meats, I was doing like 1.2, and this is actually protein controlled. I eat 1 gram per pound of body weight, and so that I'm not introducing that as a variable, but eating more seafood and a little bit more poly and monounsaturated fats tended to increase my ketones quite a lot. And then I wanted to play with this sesame oil experiment. So sesame oil is interesting because of the seed oils, it has the lowest oxidation profile. It's actually a kind of high linoleic acid, but it has a low oxidation profile because of these lignin antioxidants. It's actually been shown sesame products to be used in osteoarthritis, interestingly enough. It's one of the oldest, seed products consumed, tahini and sesame. And it has some interesting properties. The lignins can maybe increase alcohol dehydrogenase and beta oxidation enzymes. And I also wanted to investigate, or I was curious, and I haven't gotten the inflammation markers back yet, but we say seed oils are terrible, and more or less I think they are. I see no use for soybean oil, corn oil, this, that, or the other, but we say similar that like people say that like saturated fat is bad, but that's in a mixed diet context. When you have the cheeseburger from McDonald's, don't blame the bun and the cheese and the burger and all the processed food for what the complex did for what it's in the burger or in the cheese. I think the same actually holds true for omega-6s. I do think there's a problem with, and there's good data to suggest there's a problem if your ratio is way off. But in general, just like, is omega-6 necessarily in and of itself inflammatory if you have a low baseline inflammation? My HSCRP runs always below 0.3. So it's like immeasurably low. Other markers of inflammation low. My oxidative stress F2 isoprostane is below 0.47. Again, immeasurably low. So my baseline is really low oxidative stress, great insulin sensitivity, and low inflammation. So what would sesame oil do in me? One, is it problematic? And two, because there's an omega-6s are actually they're better at ketogenesis, and it has these sesame oil in particular has these effects on enzymes. So what would happen? Just substituting in 3 tablespoons, 2 to 3 tablespoons of sesame oil a night. Now I'm even down to 1.5, and it hasn't changed the effect. For like a little bit of coconut oil or a little bit of ghee, as boost my ketones in the morning from like 1.2 to 2.5.
That's a big boost for a very small change in the percentage of your diet, actually.
It's a tiny percent. I eat well over 300 grams of fat a day. It's tiny. So
yeah,
it's interesting.
Tons of saturated fat. Your liver is completely protected from whatever amounts of linoleic acid you're going to be eating.
I would assume so. I mean, sometimes I've gone higher. If I go above like 6 tablespoons, then I get it becomes uncomfortable in other ways. Then I actually do get diarrhea. But actually, but like this is a case in point where like you live the N=1 lifestyle, and then if you actually find little backups, and so it's like, oh, if I'm really constipated and I need to get stuff out, I'll just like chug some sesame oil. And weirdly enough, MCT does not bring up my ketones. If I take pure C8,
really,
my ketones do not go up. I don't know what the hell is going on there. But
that's interesting.
I've tried it and tried it again, and it might have something to do with my ApoE4 status. That is, it binds LDL receptors, same as ApoB. In fact, it's a better binding partner than ApoB. It changes maybe the trafficking of saturated fats. Like, we definitely don't have data on people with LDLs of 550 for a long period of time. We definitely don't have data on the 2% of the population that is ApoE plus that phenotype. Like, multiply those probabilities, and the fraction of the population is probably me plus maybe one other person. I don't know. But not a lot of people. I just think this is such a cool. I think you and I, as young people in the space, share this enthusiasm for and probably a gratitude for hitting this movement and this space like right at the
Oh
right
yeah,
time.
man.
Right
Couldn't have
as
said
it's
it better
taking off.
myself.
I feel so bad when I hear people at this conference talk like, I've been working on this for like 20 years and it's so frustrating. I'm like, I'm really like, thank you. I don't know.
Yeah,
Because I'm
that's
just
so
like,
true.
we're hitting it as it's taking off. And it's just gonna change the future, and I'm confident about that. And
Mhm.
if you haven't, and if other people haven't heard of the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, I don't know if you have. It just got
Not sure I
launched. It's a
have.
501c3 organization that is spun out of low carb, but it's going to be the hub for metabolic health. It's, as Adele Height says, it's one voice for metabolic health. And so you can list yourself there as a practitioner. You can get accredited and get a metabolic health practitioner, basically degree. So I'm going to put that after my name, Dr.
Nice.
Nick Norwitz, MD, PhD, MHP, metabolic health practitioner. And anybody can do it. You don't need other degrees, and there are lots of networks to get accredited. You can become a founding member right now or a member at some point. I think it's an amazing organization to support. I do want to plug it.
Yeah, let's put it in the show notes. I'll make a note of that.
Yeah. So we can send a link to that. But yeah, it's I'm just
That's excellent.
I just get enthused, and you can tell I have a degree of energy. Like this morning, I couldn't sleep because of excited about the conference papers I had to read, and my mind should be shot. And it was. You can confirm for the listeners how scatterbrained I was trying to figure out time zones on Twitter. But then I get here and talk with you, and it's exciting.
Well, yeah, because you're in a sense you're the typical low carb who had the come to Jesus moment, who actually had a massive improvement in a serious condition. Because I'll be honest, I've never had as bad a flare up as this, like not even close. I've had a lot of improvements from low carb. I've had my allergies have gone, my puffy face have gone, my chronic rhinitis has gone. I've put on muscle mass. I've leaned out. I've gotten stronger. I'm up to 80 kilos now. The max I've been is 82 kilos, and I started at 72, 73. And I'm lucky because I didn't have my ulcerative colitis never got that bad where I had weight loss, and it's usually people with Crohn's who tend to lose a ton of weight compared to people with UC. So there are many aspects where I've been lucky. I've had asthma as a kid. I was given antibiotics as a kid, basically as soon as I was born. Luckily I wasn't a C-section baby, so that helped me. My mother breastfed me, so I've had some advantages, disadvantages, but yeah, low carb has made a massive difference for me. And no wonder that you want to proselytize it and all that. And I think it should be, encouraged, of course. And when there's bias, then point it out. But,
Yeah, I don't want to be zealous about it, and I don't want to necessarily just proselytize it. And I'm personally not religious, so
me neither.
I wouldn't call it I know what you meant, but I think it should be an option. And Tro just talked about this yesterday at the Low Carb Book Conference, is that there's flexibility in the guidelines. It should be an option. It's not the be all end all. I'm not saying you can't eat carbs and be healthy. That's absolutely a possibility. But it should be an option. And right now it's not. And that's what's frustrating.
I'll turn in my keto card. Check out my honey. I don't know if you can see it. Oh no.
What kind of honey is it?
This is like the thick granulous honey, not the like syrupy one. Yeah, I love honey.
After reading actually I have it right here. Paul Saladino's the Carnivore Code. He was saying he experimented with honey, then I started experimenting with honey. Weird. This is really weird. Again, just a totally weird thing for me. I found that most honey irritates my gut, but not buckwheat honey.
Really?
No idea why. Wow. It's one of the darker honeys. Darker honeys tend to have more antioxidants, so I don't know if that has anything to do with it. But yeah, buckwheat honey seems to sit okay with me.
Interesting.
I just don't know why. And honeycomb. And these are things I use for like targeted carbs post-workout. I think we're both pretty active, and so in those circumstances, actually, I think it's nice to get a little kick after the workout when your muscles are receptive. So people don't know, muscle contractions stimulate insulin-independent translocation of the glutathione transporter to the muscle membrane. So it actually just sucks up, glucose right after. And so you can target carb replenishment in your muscles and not your liver if you have post-workout carbs. And I'm not having a lot. I'm having like 20, 25 grams, which ends up being 3% or less of my caloric intake.
Yeah, so it's nearly a rounding error basically. And yet I think it makes a signaling difference.
Huge difference in performance, which is really cool. But no, I felt like I had to caveat that. I feel like sometimes you say, oh, I had this, and you're like, how dare you go off the
No,
also,
I'm still on.
details.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, just when I say post-workout carbs, I'm not saying a bowl of pasta.
Right.
Point of reference of like having almost no carbs in my diet. A little coconut, a little dark chocolate kind of deal. But anyway, yeah, it's one point you made, or something you commented on that I actually want to again tie back to the beginning with Seco, is like you leaned out. And that was one of the things, that was the one thing I hated about keto, which most people love, is, and I think that really drew me to it as metabolic intervention, is when I went on it, I just assumed I'm going to try to, to allow me to eat more calories. I'm going to get more fat in, and I can tolerate that more than the carbs I was eating. And so I'll gain some weight. And I dropped weight, and I couldn't stop dropping weight. And it was like, damn it. I'm somebody who's relatively weight resistant, but it's just like, it astonished me that now to maintain a lower body weight than I was previously. So previously, so when I was at my peak athletic performance, running marathons, training 100 miles a week, going on 20-mile runs, I would eat the same or fewer calories than I can eat now without gaining weight, and my weight is lower and my body fat is lower. And I don't do any cardio. I've cut out cardio because it's just, I don't want to expend the calories.
Right.
It just makes food too much. And it's just, again, back to Seco, it's like, okay, yeah, technically the energy being taken into my body minus the energy taken out of my body, that flux is elevated. If you look at those numbers, like if you really could look at those numbers, it's elevated, but that's distinct from the calories one could count that I'm eating and the ease with which you could count my expenditure, because it's not just looking at the food you eat, and it's way more complicated than that. First of all, there's not accuracy in the food nutrition labels. FDA allows a 20% margin of error. Microbiome differences in individuals, how you partition the fuel. Rob Sivey's had a great comment on this on one of his YouTube lectures. It was like, gorillas, they eat all those plants, they must be carb-based. No, actually, they get 60% of their calories from fat because they have microbiomes that allow them to turn the fiber into fat. So 57.3% of their calories, I think it was the Western lowland gorilla, come from fiber that is turned into short-chain fatty acids. We can't do that. Anyway, that's an aside.
The terrible saturated fat.
What? Yeah. Well, the short-chain fatty acids are, and carbs are turned preferentially into saturated fat, which is why eating carbs, not fat, increases saturated fat in the blood. And that was like the Hyde paper showed that very nicely. Isocaloric diets, and it was, low fat, medium carb, and low carb. And it was a low carb group. It was eating 100 grams of saturated fat a day, versus the low fat group was 40 grams of saturated fat a day. Guess who had higher saturated fat in their blood? The low fat group. By a significant amount. And it's just like, well, that's de novo lipogenesis for you, creating palmitic acid. And people still don't get that. Like, doctors still don't get that. I was writing a report for someone, and they're like, but you're eating more fat. Like, is it going to increase your triglycerides? I'm like, well, it doesn't.
Doesn't.
I don't know what you want to do. Here's the panel. Here's the biology. It's like, yes, I understand your confusion, but just delve a little bit deeper. But you can even hear I'm getting a little bit arrogant and dogmatic. The frustration.
No, but it's normal, man. I had to, the number of times I went to see my doctor, and I'm like, I would like to do this test, and she gives me a ton of shit, and then I'm like, look, I'm gonna do it, and then I come back to her, I'm like, here are the results. She's like, oh man, you were right. And it's annoying because the discussion could have been productive even in a disagreement, but often they're not. Like in my experience with a gastroenterologist, I've known my what do you call it, primary physician, they're not mean, but they're just not pleasant. They're not, you can't debate stuff. They're not here to debate stuff with you. They're just here to tell you what to do. And that is not the doctor's role. That's just not their role, really. So it's annoying. It's really annoying.
Yeah, it's I understand where they're coming from. I can imagine as a doctor having patients come in all the time. Like, I read this on the internet. Like,
Yeah, that's annoying too. Fair enough.
After doing like an MD PhD, I'm gonna be pissed off when some person comes to me and just like, they tell me about this bullshit on the internet. Like, let me get, I don't know, my astrological signs aligned, then do some like voodoo and whatever. And so I get it. I'll get whether it be frustration. It's like, listen, I have a lot of work to do. Just like listen to what I'm saying. That said, when somebody like,
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you didn't go to your doctor and be like, oh yeah, I read in this magazine that this keto diet is awesome. I want to try it. You were like, hey, I've probably read some studies, and that should, like, they should be like, someone read some studies? I don't even read studies. Most doctors don't read studies, so they're like, wow, to tell me what you know. So yeah, you're right. You're right.
Doctors really like that and receptive. The doctors that, okay, I have two problems or had two problems. I reversed my ulcerative colitis. Also, I had osteoporosis after my marathon career ended prematurely, which is weird for me. But my doctors misdiagnosed, or I think misdiagnosed me with a condition called REDS, relative energy deprivation syndrome, which is I wasn't eating enough, again, calories, which is a little bit silly considering I was drinking jars of Nutella, basically. But be that as it will. I came back later with a different hypothesis. I actually put together a case report, and they read it, and they changed their minds enough to both jump on board and support me on that was my first author publication. With a case report myself, I was supported by these doctors who were very, again, at the end of it, open-minded. When I went through the effort to compile some stuff for them, they're time pressed, so you have to make it interesting and short. You can't just say read these 20 papers that I found on the internet and I read.
Right.
But if you as a patient actually went through the time and then make like a one-page document to bring to your doctors, like, here are the summary points with the references, I think they're likely to be receptive. I don't encourage people to actually try to do that. You don't have to write a case report or do a genetic screen. I did whole genetics. I have a VCF file. I got a genetic test done from Veritas, all 3 billion base pairs. This is not 23andMe. This is the whole damn genome. And I can actually go through now the VCF file, and if there's an RS code for a new SNP that comes up, I can just search it and see if I have it.
Oh, that's cool.
But significance on a gene called LH5, which we can talk for 2 more hours about Wnt signaling, which people have probably never heard of, but I won't do that to people.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's doctors are good people. People go into medicine because they want to help people. Remember, I think our community really needs to remember that. I put up way too many tweets to which replies are like, doctors are just trying to make money. They're idiots, this, that, or the other. They're not. They're not trying to make money. They want to help you. Help them help you. And, I think there are ways.
There's the I can't remember the exact saying, but I think it goes, don't assign to malice what is probably incompetence, essentially. And I think that's a good heuristic to try to use.
Or lack of exposure. I think that people think doctors should know everything. It's a responsibility to know everything. There's no reason they should know everything. They got 4 extra years of school plus some residency. And they didn't get nutrition education. So there's no reason they should get nutrition education, but it's not the individual's fault that they don't know more about saturated fats than you. Sad as it is. I think they should, but I think it's a systemic problem. And so thank you, and thank everybody that I'm, meeting on Twitter and at these conferences, just for the camaraderie and for pushing this space forward, because it's really, really exciting to be here.
Yeah, look, Twitter was my basically my education before I even applied to the master's in molecular biology that I got a few years back. It was literally reading Peter of Hyperlipid's blog and being frustrated that I couldn't understand it, and spending so much time trying to geek out on the textbooks and the papers. I was like, well, I might as well get a degree for it. That was sort of my foray into the space. So as much as I hate the censorship on Twitter and all of the infighting, I just have to admit it's been fantastic for me. So I don't know how longer I'll stay on it, but I'm still finding it useful.
it's a good place for advocacy, especially for people like you and me who are developing credentials. It's good to have a platform so you can speak directly to people. And I think it'll be an outlet for me in medical school when I'm biting my tongue, when they're showing me my plate.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll try to
either come out expelled or with some bleeding lips.
Yeah, something like that. So to close off the talk, because I'm guessing this is going to be our first of a few, I hope. What is the thought, concept, thing that's in your mind at the moment that you would like more attention be brought to it? What do you think? What are people missing? Right, you know a lot of smart people on Twitter and in your PhD and now your MD. What would you wish is like, oh man, if only people knew, they should know.
So I'll give a general answer that's uninteresting, and then a personal answer that's maybe a tad more interesting. The general answer is we need to know more about how atherosclerosis and heart disease, which is the #1 killer of Americans, actually works. There's some amazing models out there. Feldman's energy model is really interesting. And then you have people like Dr. Dayspring who have another point of view. And then you have people, Sabotin, it was on Ivor Cummins' podcast talking about the Vasovasorum and the outside-in model, which is a new hypothesis that I heard of. And we need to figure that shit out because it's killing a quarter of us, something like that. The fact that we don't have it figured out is absurd. And the fact that it's being, the road bump is the lipid hypothesis, which I think has been debunked, is also frustrating. And then the personal one that I think I want more, there is some research on this, but chronobiology and the microbiome, how timing affects your gut. Because as someone with gut problems, people don't understand that for me is actually one of the biggest things. I cannot eat after like 6:30 in the evening. If I eat at 7, it can really be a domino chain effect that lasts for days. And I could eat this, same particular food in the morning. I could have a block of Roquefort cheese in the morning. Wouldn't have a little bit of that in the evening, or actually if I have more red meat in the evening, it really causes problems. And I don't know. I don't really understand why. It has something to do with my bugs in my gut, waking up and going to sleep, and probably some peripheral hormones, but chronobiology and eating, I'd love to understand that, because I think that is a huge thing we're missing. And I also think it complicates individuals' empirical observations of themselves. So like, this is a safe food, this is not a safe food, but when did you eat it?
Right.
That becomes like, when you ask people to titrate back in foods and they conclude that I can't have chocolate because I ate it and it felt bad. Well, what if you ate it at a different time?
Because you always watch it. You always eat it when you're watching Netflix at night or something.
That's chronobiology is so interesting. And it intersects with everything. In fact, I probably shouldn't say this, but I can say this now because I finished my PhD. I wanted to look at NAD levels in the brain, and we did a 31p MRS brain scan study on that.
Oh, cool.
We actually were looking at beta ATP levels, but that was a secondary outcome. We were looking at NAD levels, and I didn't realize until afterwards. It was we didn't have the funds to do a proper control group, so it was like a baseline and a follow up as a primer, and it was in the morning. But NAD fluctuates on a circadian rhythm. I should have known that because it intersects with sirtuins. I should have figured that one out. But then I look at the curves, and it's like, ooh. Like if I'm bringing patients in at 8 doing the fasted scan, and then at 10 doing the next scan after the ketones,
right?
And that's it. And there's a circadian influence. You can see why that's problematic. And nobody on the team thought of it. I didn't think of it. And then we funnel money into this study. The results, it wouldn't have mattered anyway, put it that way. But it's just like, this chronobiology stuff is everywhere.
So it's really cool you brought up the 31p study you did, because actually I have a paper from 2017 that sort of, well, it sort of influenced my thinking for my PhD, because there's evidence that there's redox dysregulation in schizophrenia, looking at NAD, NADH ratios. And they use the same technique that you did. And I actually have to go back to the paper now and see if they mention when they measured what. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it either.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Schizophrenia is interesting because it's a dopaminergic disease in part, like Parkinson's, which is what I study. So there's a lot of intersections. You've maybe read Chris Palmer's 2 reviews on, there's 2 case series on the schizophrenia. Man.
Amazing.
Like the one woman, 53, I think it was 82, 53-year history of schizophrenia. Yeah. Then she went keto. It's gone.
Boom.
What the hell? Like, and what are the mechanisms? I mean, we can go through a million, NAD included.
And she goes on and off it, and she can show that if she goes off it, it comes back, and she goes on it, and it goes away. So it's reproducible. This is really important. I think people miss that in case reports, because you can actually do controls in case reports.
Yeah. No, it is kind of scary, and then just
Yeah.
I've been having things that pop into my mind, but I don't want to just kind of like bait this on to be 6 hours, especially when I probably should go back to the conference at some point.
Yeah, I should let you get back to the conference, because you don't want to miss a lot of the good talks. But man, we could talk for hours, and let's do it again. Anytime you have, even just like a paper. You want to talk about a paper and we can review it, whatever.
Oh, this is the one that remember how I said at the beginning is the first thing I said, Ben Bickman? Yeah. This is actually a 2010 paper, but it's really interesting to insulin resistance. Look it up. It's Lee and PNAS 2010, bifurcation of insulin signaling pathway in the rat liver. It talks about how the mechanism by which in insulin resistance, insulin will still stimulate lipogenesis, the creation of fat in the liver, but then gluconeogenesis changes. So the net effect of insulin resistance is your liver is pumping out sugar and fat. And there's actually bifurcation in insulin signaling. So he mentioned that. I actually asked him the question, his offhand comment. I'm like, there's no way he'll know the answer, like the reference, and he did. And I'm like, oh, well, that's Ben.
Of course. Of course.
Yeah, I was like, this paper bifurcation. He like totally knew the title. He's like, I don't remember the year. I'm like, I'll give you a break. You knew the title. I just Googled it. It was there.
Yeah, please don't give me the PMID. You're going to make me feel bad.
Oh yeah, he just remember it. There's like PMIDs everywhere, and I'm just like, dude, I'm so impressed. I put in the comments like, damn, those PMIDs. There were so many.
Yeah, man. Anyway, it was great meeting you for the first time on video and getting a podcast out of it. So that was a lot of fun for me. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Hopefully people will enjoy it and maybe learn something or two.